He thought his simplification was a clever patch. He thought he was just making it look better, but he didn't realize he was deleting the very intelligence of the system. My code was the engine of Aurora Systems, and when he touched it, everything started to seize up. The first thing you notice about a good codebase is the quiet confidence it projects. It's not flashy. It doesn't scream for attention with unnecessary animations or jargon-filled comments. It just works. It hums along, efficient and elegant, like a well-tuned engine that knows exactly what it's supposed to do. My code, the engine of Aurora Systems' entire customer engagement platform, was that. It was the secret sauce, the intellectual property that made them look indispensable, the thing their billion-dollar valuation was actually built upon. I had spent 3 years of my life breathing life into that architecture, lying by painstaking lying, debugging until my eyes burned, optimizing until my coffee intake became a medical necessity. It was mine. When I look back at those early commits, the initial sketches in Markdown, the complex logic gates that manage the data flow, it felt like a conversation I was having with the digital world. Each function was a word, each class a sentence, and the whole sprawling repository was a novel of pure functionality. Aurora wasn't just a company. It was the vessel for my creation, and I was the captain. The initial friction was small, almost negligible, a polite request from David in product management to streamline the user authentication module. I agreed, because collaboration is the supposed virtue of modern industry. He pointed to a section of my elegant, recursive login checker and suggested, rather dismissively, that it was over-engineered. I countered with the performance metrics, showing him how it handled peak load 4 times faster than his proposed linear. Till whooshen, he just waved a hand, a gesture of supreme condescension, and said, "It's too complicated, Alex. Let's make it simpler for the masses." I thought, fine. Simplification is often the enemy of perfection, but sometimes it's necessary for market adoption. So, I began the refactor. It wasn't a simple copy-paste replacement. It was a surgical extraction. I had to map every edge case, every potential failure point, every obscure interaction with the payment gateway and rebuild it from the ground up, adhering to his simpler, albeit slightly shallower paradigm. It took 2 weeks of focused, caffeine-fueled misery. When I submitted the pull request, expecting a standard review process, a couple of comments, maybe a minor suggestion about variable naming, I got a different kind of reaction. A silence, followed by a single terse Slack message from David. Approved. Cleaned up. It was the word cleaned up that started the tremor of suspicion in my gut. Cleaned up. As if my masterpiece was some slightly dusty antique needing a quick buff, rather than a finely crafted machine demanding reverence. The next escalation was swift and brutal. 3 weeks later, a major client, Stellar Corp, reported a strange latency issued during their monthly batch processing. The engineering team scrambled, and eventually, they traced the bottleneck not to a server issue, nor a database lock, but directly into the authentication module, the one David insisted on simplifying. We dove into the code together, and that's when the true horror set in. My logic, the recursive check that handled cascading session timeouts, was there, but it was behaving strangely under the new, simpler structure. It wasn't crashing, it was stuttering. It was inefficiently looping, consuming resources at an alarming rate, turning what should have been a near-instantaneous handshake into a 5-second crawl. Alex, Sarah, the lead backend architect, said, leaning over my shoulder, her voice tight with professional panic, "This shouldn't be possible." The complexity was what was stabilizing it. The simplicity was supposed to make it lighter. It's heavier but slower, like it's getting lost in the simplicity. I started tracing the call stack, feeling a cold, acidic burn rise in my chest. The simplification hadn't just made it less complicated. It had fundamentally altered the behavior of the logic. David hadn't just replaced the code. He had overwritten the assumptions. He had taken the intricate dance of my code and forced it into a rigid, predictable, and ultimately insufficient square. I pulled up the original commit history. There it was. The timestamp matched. The commit message was simple: refactor off, simplifying complexity for better user flow. But buried in the diff, line by line, was the evidence of his arrogance. He hadn't optimized. He had dumbed down. He had traded robustness for perceived readability. The next confrontation was in the executive meeting, the one where the CTO, Mr. Henderson, was glowering at the performance graphs. "Alex," Mr. Henderson began, his tone dangerously level. "What happened to your original auth module? It was magnificent. This new version, it feels like it's running on dial-up." "It's not running on dial-up, sir," I interrupted, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "It's running on a flawed simplification." David replaced my recursion recursive structure with a flat series of conditional checks. It works, yes, but it fails to account for the asynchronous session decay pattern inherent in our global deployment. The original code didn't just check if a session was active, it checked how it was active, factoring in regional latency and load. Dewey, seated next to the CTO, puffed out his chest. Alex, please. It's standard practice. We abstracted the recursion into a helper function. It's maintainable. It's readable. It's what the marketing team wants to talk about. Readability at the cost of viability? I shot back, feeling the heat rising in my face, the familiar slow burn of injustice finally boiling over. It's like putting a pretty coat of paint on a structurally unsound building. David. It looks good in the boardroom, but when the pressure hits, the foundation cracks. Mr. Henderson looked from David's smug face to mine, and for the first time, there was a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes. He understood the language of code. He understood the difference between surface polish and deep integrity. Can you fix it, Alex? Yes, I can, I said, my voice dropping to a resonant level, the tone of absolute certainty. But fixing it requires a complete rollback and reintegration of the original logic structure, which will require a full redeployment cycle. It will take 72 hours. Minimum. David scoffed again. 72 hours? We have the Q3 rollout next week. We can patch it incrementally. Just let us try to brute force the latency issue first. Brute forcing an architectural flaw is like kicking a collapsing dam. I retorted, it might hold for a day, maybe two, but the pressure will find the weakest seam, and then it will burst, taking everything down with it. We need to restore the integrity. The argument continued, a grinding, petty battle fought over abstract concepts of elegance versus expediency. David kept pushing the incremental patch. Sarah kept whispering wordly to Mr. Henderson. Henderson looked at the clock, then at the glowing performance metrics showing the creeping degradation, and finally, he looked at me. Alex, he said finally, the decision made. You take it. Full rollback. 72 hours. And you report to me every 4 hours. No excuses. The sense of triumph was intoxicating. A pure, clean rush of validation. I've been heard. My 3 years of sweat, my sleepless nights, my elegant solution. It was being restored to its rightful place at the core of the beast. The next 3 days were a blur of frantic, glorious work. I lived in the server room annex, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer righteous fury of the rollback. Every time I merged a branch, every time a test suite passed with a satisfying green flash, a small piece of the injustice dissolved. When the final deployment went live, the performance metrics didn't just look good. They were singing. The latency was gone. The system was humming at its peak efficiency. Stellar Corp's reports came in. Unbelievable stability. Faster than anticipated. David tried to look pleased, a thin, forced smile plastered on his face. Well, Alex, good work. Really, you saved our bacon. But the triumph felt incomplete. It was only half the battle. He had damaged the code, but the damage to the trust was deeper. He had signaled to the entire organization that my work was disposable, that my genius could be overwritten by a hurried, aesthetically pleasing shortcut. The final meeting was held on Friday afternoon. The air in the conference room felt heavy, charged with the lingering tension of near disaster. Mr. Henderson was beaming, radiating approval. David was leaning back, basking in the reflected glow of my success. Alex, Henderson said, gesturing around the table, you are indispensable. This platform is built on your foundation. You are, without question, the chief architect of Aurora Systems' core functionality. David leaned forward, ready with his pre-rehearsed rebuttal, something about team synergy or leverage in collective insight. But before David could speak, I looked at Mr. Henderson, and then at David, and I delivered my final, quiet verdict. Thank you, sir. It was necessary. Necessary? Henderson prompted. Yes, the system required the original architecture to function at peak capacity. David's simplification, while superficially appealing, introduced critical instability. It was a flaw in the philosophy of the code, not just the lines. David opened his mouth, ready to argue about the readability again. I cut him off, and this time, my voice held the weight of the entire 3-year project, the sleepless nights, the debugging agony, the sheer, unyielding pride. But I also noticed something else during the rollback. I continued, my gaze locking onto David's. When the system was running on my original code, the authentication module wasn't just efficient, it was subtly, almost elegantly, self-optimizing. It learned from the traffic patterns. It adjusted its resource allocation based on regional load spikes before they even peaked. David's code, in its simplicity, was static. It was brittle. I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. Brittle, predictable, inelegant. So, while you were busy making it look nice, I finished, a small, almost predatory smile touching my lips. You weren't just deleting code, you were deleting the intelligence. Mr. Henderson nodded slowly, absorbing the critique. David looked like he was being slowly suffocated by the sheer force of my technical superiority. And what did that realization lead to, Alex? Henderson asked, his voice a low rumble of anticipation. This was it. The moment for the grand, dramatic, let's crash the server move. The moment to unleash the nuclear option. I leaned forward, mirroring his posture, and let the final truth spill out, perfectly calibrated to hurt David while simultaneously proving my point to Henderson. It led me to realize that while the code is proprietary, the control over that code is mine. David thought he could overwrite my creation, but he forgot that the mechanism controlling the overwrite is the ultimate gatekeeper. I met his eyes, and the rage, the simmering injustice, finally found its perfect, devastating target. So, before I pushed the rollback, I did one final, tiny thing. A safeguard. A little piece of self-preservation that only the original logic understands. David finally managed to speak. A strangled, desperate plea. What did you do? Did you leave a backdoor? I shook my head, shaking my head slowly, savoring the moment. Oh, backdoors are messy. Too obvious. I didn't leave a backdoor, David. I revoked your keys. The room fell utterly silent. When I restored the original recursive structure, I explained, gesturing toward the screen where the system dashboard was glowing a steady, vibrant green. The code didn't just run, it executed a secondary, almost invisible subroutine. It identified every single deployment token, every API key, every administrative credential granted to the David profile, and marked them for immediate, global invalidation. The code didn't just fix the bug, it performed an audit of the damage. I paused again, letting the implications of a complete, silent digital revocation wash over them. You might have thought you were just making the authentication module simpler, David, but in doing so, you didn't just break the system. You gave the original architecture the perfect pretext to assert its dominance. You deleted my code, but in the process, you handed me the administrative permission to delete your access. Henderson stared at David, whose face had cycled through shock, disbelief, and finally, a dawning, horrified understanding. David tried to speak, perhaps to argue that the tokens were backed up, that he had emergency admin rights. But I cut him off with a barely perceptible shake of my head. The system says they are gone, I stated calmly. Effective, immediately. Your ability to push updates, to view live logs, to even access the primary production environment from your personal workstation, has been terminated by the very logic you tried to simplify. You are now a highly paid consultant who can only look at the beautiful, working engine through a reinforced glass window. The finality of a Hunion absolute, elegant, and utterly deserved. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to rage anymore. The deep, satisfying thrum of victory was resonating right through my bones. I had taken the quiet dignity of my creation, the painstaking perfection of my work, and transformed it into the most devastating act of corporate revenge possible. I hadn't just saved Aurora Systems. I had re-established the hierarchy, and I had done it using nothing more than a beautifully written line of recursive logic that finally, beautifully, did exactly what it was supposed to do. It asserted its will.